nightmares.
The sun was barely visible when I made it over the barrier wall. Low clouds again, pale light cutting through just enough to give me a general idea of the hour. Probably early morning. I judged it by how dim the pools were between buildings, and how the wind carried cold through the trees that had grown along the west side of the outer wall. The clock I built from scrap said it was past 10, but that thing's never right for more than a day. Even now, the second hand ticks in uneven jolts and resets every few minutes. I keep it on anyway. Feels like something to check, even if it lies. The climb over the slope took longer than I expected. The concrete's cracking in bigger pieces every season, and what used to be a scaffold trail is now half buried under collapsed fencing and root growth. The rope I used was fraying in the middle, and my shoulder still aches from when the knot slipped a few days ago. But the drop wasn't far. I tied the rope off in case I have to come back this way, though I don't plan to. If there's another path out, I'll take it. If not, then I'll make one, or I won't leave at all. Everything inside the wall looks worse than it did from the ridge. Water fills entire streets now. Rows of submerged cars poke out like broken teeth, moss and scum growing thick around their frames. Whatever pumps were built to manage flood overflow gave up long ago. No wildlife up high. Just a few darting shapes deeper in the water. Maybe fish, maybe not. The buildings are still standing mostly. Third and fourth floors seem dry. Lower levels are too far gone. I stay elevated where I can, walking across rusted catwalks and crumbling skywalks that connect a few of the towers. The air smells like damp metal and something older. I'm heading toward the structure I spotted from the ridge last week. Looked like a communications tower, still mostly intact. Vines crawling up its sides, antennas bent at strange angles, the upper deck wrapped in rusted wire mesh. Might have been a relay site back during the first few years of the outbreak. If the core's sealed, there could be storage or power units still untouched. Maybe logs, maybe something useful, maybe nothing. I'm not here for weapons or medicine. I'm here for records. Old ones. Getting inside took time. The bottom floors were sealed off or under 3 feet of dark water. I climbed in through a ventilation shaft that had been ripped open by weather or something heavier, dropped down into what used to be an equipment floor. Dust coated everything. Some of the older consoles were still bolted to the walls. I stepped around broken plastic, bits of insulation, and what looked like water-damaged tape reels still in their casings. I found a reinforced hatch tucked behind a rack of collapsed shelving, label barely visible under the grime. Took a few tries with the crowbar to pry it loose. The hinges shrieked when it gave. Beyond it was a narrow stairwell, lined in old foam padding, running deeper underground. I went down slowly, listening with every step. The air was still, but not clean. A mix of mold and something like iron. I kept my hand on the wall as I descended, counting the turns. By the third landing, the water on the floor was ankle deep. At the bottom, I came to a blast door with a crank lock. It was still sealed. That's not common. Most places like this have already been looted or broken down. This one hadn't been touched. Took a while to get it open. The crank resisted hard, then gave suddenly. I braced as the door cracked open and cold, dry air rushed out. Whatever was behind it had been closed off for decades. The room was shaped like a bunker. Reinforced walls. Metal flooring that echoed even under my padded boots. Dead consoles lined the sides. Blinking lights long gone. Power was out, of course. A static burst of dust drifted into my light beam. Shelves of labeled cassettes lined the walls. In the center of the room, behind a desk welded into the floor, was a man's body, dried down to the frame, still seated, still shackled to the armrests with both wrists locked in place. No blood, no trauma. Clothes faded beyond recognition but seemed like an old technician's uniform. He had been there a long time, maybe since the last broadcasts. His head tilted slightly, chin resting on chest, bones still held together by what remained of skin and tendon. There was a small recording unit beside him. No power, but I saw a plastic folder tucked beneath one elbow, kept sealed with 2 leather straps. I pulled it out gently and stepped away before opening it. The cover was marked in plain lettering: Field Guide, Infected Behavior, Combat Conditions, and Survival Philosophy, version 6, compiled by Operator Gray Station 9 Echo. Inside were typewritten pages, hundreds of them, sectioned with numbers, dates, and titles, annotated in the margins with fine pen strokes. Whoever wrote it wasn't just guessing. He documented everything: infected types, behavioral patterns, survival tactics, failure cases, field notes, even radio frequency interactions. The first page started with a message that was short and blunt. If you're reading this, I'm already dead. If you're in this room, you've survived something. This might help you survive more. The infected evolve. They learn. They change. If you don't, you die. He wasn't poetic. He wasn't trying to be remembered. He was just writing to pass something on. From the way it's structured, this wasn't a personal journal. It's more like a field manual, built over time, piece by piece, probably as things changed around him. I flipped through a few pages. Each section starts with a classification. Type 1. Standard, slow, decomposed, strong response to movement and noise, driven mostly by reaction and proximity, described in full in Chapter 1. Type 2. Runner, developed in mid-climate zones, faster, still muscular, highly responsive, seen in earlier post-collapse years, less common now. Type 3. Sleeper, minimal external damage, can remain still for long periods, possibly months, possibly longer, reactivated by sound, movement, or changes in air density, often mistaken for corpses. Dangerous. I've seen things like that. Bodies that didn't move until it was too late. Nobody ever agreed on what to call them. Some thought they were just slow. Some thought they were faking death. I thought those people were superstitious. Maybe they were just reading old manuals. Maybe Gray was right, and nobody listened. The pages keep going. There's mention of something called pack reactive carriers. Something about radio wave response. I'll need time to read it all. The manual's thicker than it looks. There are entire appendices in the back, written in smaller print, folded maps tucked into the last sleeve. I set up my mat in the corner farthest from the door, ate a small portion of dried meat, drank from my filter pouch, and left one of the lanterns glowing low. The air is dry here, the kind that's only found in sealed places. I think this room stayed closed since before I was born. The dust hasn't been disturbed. Even the rat trails are old. I'll spend the night down here. I'm not tired yet, but I want to go through the first few chapters before I check the lower levels. There might be more storage rooms, maybe backup systems. If the generator is intact, I could charge the recorder and start logging the full manual properly. For now, I'll keep speaking it aloud. Even if nobody hears it, it feels right, like preserving something that still matters. If Gray really wrote this all 90 years ago, and some of it still applies now, then that means we've been surviving the same way longer than anyone's willing to admit. Maybe we forgot too much. Maybe what happened wasn't a collapse. Maybe it was just a slow fade. The way this manual is written, it's meant for people who didn't grow up reading technical reports. The instructions are clear and direct. Short sentences, bullet points, repeated phrases. Some parts even feel like they were meant to be read over a radio, spoken out loud to keep people calm. But then, I hit entire sections where the language changes. Words I have never heard before. Phrases that don't line up with how we talk now. I've been reading old gear manuals since I was a kid. Stuff written for backup generators, desalinators, water towers, old electric pump arrays. I can piece together meaning even when half the diagrams are gone. But this, some of Gray's entries are built on knowledge I think no one uses anymore. He describes signal harmonics, infection load thresholds, transmission vectors from cryo-breach zones. Some of it feels more scientific than anything I've ever seen, but other parts sound like someone writing instructions in a panic, trying to make sure the next person doesn't mess up the same way. I wanted to read just a few more pages before trying to sleep. My body was tired, but my head wasn't done. No food or water left in this room, not even wrappers or old rations. So whoever Gray was, he either lived light or used the place only as a final station. It looks like no one ever tried to loot it. The door was untouched, and the layers of dust make it clear that even the rats didn't bother. Whatever was left in here must have been taken long ago or used up before the room was sealed. One section near the front of the guide caught my attention. It was labeled Sensory Triggers, Chapter 1, Revised. It had a bold title underlined in red pen. If it doesn't smell, it's not dead enough. Gray breaks it down into direct points. He describes how most survivors learned early on to trust their noses. A room full of infected has a certain smell. Wet rot, stomach acid, mildew, whatever's leaking from broken skin and exposed organs. That smell builds up in sealed areas, especially if there are still bodies in various stages of decay. But according to him, that's a trap. The most dangerous infected don't smell at all, because they haven't reached full decomposition. If someone was infected recently, or if the environment slowed the decay, like in cold, dry conditions, they can stay quiet and still for hours or days without giving off much scent. Some people assumed they were corpses. They weren't. I thought about that as I looked around the bunker. The air was dry. No scent, no sign of mold, no indication of long-term water damage or festering organic matter. Just dust and time. That's what I told myself, at least. I checked the room twice already, but I went over it again, flashlight steady, checking behind every piece of equipment, under the desk, behind the racks. Nothing moved, nothing living, nothing dead either. Still, I locked the blast door before trying to settle. It had a manual deadbolt in addition to the crank, and I used both. I rolled out my mat, lay down with the manual beside me, and kept the lantern on low. I didn't plan to sleep long. The floor's metal, and my pack's under my head. The building groans once every while, probably from the changing air pressure or shifts in the upper levels. Still, I didn't drift off right away. I kept turning pages. I landed on a subsection labeled Sound-Based Reflex Patterns. According to Gray, standard infected, what we call the walkers now, respond most strongly to short, high-volume bursts, clapping, gunfire, breaking glass, human speech. But it's not just loudness. He explains that sustained mechanical noise, engines, radio static, turbine hums, don't provoke the same immediate response. They react more to human vocal range frequencies. He suggests this might be connected to memory remnants buried in their nervous systems. That's not a phrase I've seen before, but he cites examples. One infected bypassed a running generator to go toward a whisper. Another ignored a loudspeaker but slammed into a room where someone coughed. I've heard similar stories. Things that shouldn't have drawn attention do, and other things don't. There's a lot of guessing out there. Some people think it's all random, but Gray doesn't write like a man guessing. He documents specific tests, distances, variables, outcomes. He writes about tying an old mannequin to a shopping cart, placing a radio next to it, and setting off a timed voice recording. Says 6 infected walked past it without responding, but when he added human breath sounds recorded from his own lungs, 3 changed direction. That entry was marked Year 41, Controlled Exposure Test 22. It's written in clean, even handwriting. There's no drama in how he describes it. Just data. I must have drifted off at some point. I woke up unsure how long I had been out. The lantern was still on. No sounds from outside. My clock said it had been 2 hours, but like always, it might as well have been 5 or 10 minutes. My joints were stiff. I drank the last of my water, checked my pack, and made a note to find a resupply before nightfall, whenever that comes. Down here there's no natural light. The only way I'll track time is by the feel of the air through the ducts and the temperature changes on the walls. I packed the manual back into its sleeve and wedged it into the side of my bag between a folded tarp and the backup filters. The cassette rack looked mostly empty, but I grabbed 3 of the best sealed reels and stashed them too. If I ever find a working deck again, I want to know what Gray was transmitting. There's a chance some of his old messages were live broadcasts, possibly part of a larger loop sent across relay towers. I still don't know how long this station was operational after the main grid failed, but the guide suggests Gray kept transmitting long after contact was lost with whatever command he once reported to. Before leaving, I scanned the walls again. Still nothing. The air hadn't changed. I cracked the door just enough to listen, waited a full minute, then opened it. Water in the hallway had dropped slightly. Maybe slow drainage through the concrete or pressure shifts pulling it back toward the outer channels. I followed the same stairwell I came down, moving slow, light held high, eyes steady. Every turn felt tighter going up. I made it back to the third level of the tower and stepped into the room where I first entered. Sky was pale through the broken ceiling panels. Couldn't tell where the sun was, but it was brighter than before. I marked the time mentally. I decided to explore the adjacent buildings on the same block. They used to be connected by service walkways. Most of the bridge panels had collapsed, but one steel frame still held enough structure to crawl across. It led into what was once a training facility for maintenance crews. Storage lockers lined one wall, and there was a long hallway leading to what looked like a rest area. I smelled something off before I saw it. The scent wasn't rot, not exactly, but something stale and thick, like trapped humidity and old meat. It wasn't strong, barely noticeable, but different enough that I stopped moving. I stayed low, backed into the closest storage unit, and waited. 15 minutes, maybe longer. Nothing moved. I couldn't hear steps, couldn't hear breath. I peeked around the corner and saw a body slumped in the hallway. Looked human, looked dead. But now, after what I read, I didn't trust it. I watched for movement, shoulders rising, fingers twitching, even a shift in posture. Nothing. I took out one of the small screw caps from my pack and tossed it against the opposite wall. The sound echoed once, still nothing. I circled wide, keeping my eyes locked on the body. As I passed it, the smell grew weaker, not stronger. That confirmed it. No active decay, which means either it was recently killed or something else entirely. I didn't stick around to test it. I marked the location in my notebook and moved on, making a mental note. Low scent, unknown status, type 3 likely, avoid direct return route. Gray's first rule wasn't just theory. It saved me from walking straight past what could have been a dormant carrier. Or worse, if that body moved after I passed, I might not have had a chance to react in time. The old ways of checking for safety, kicking feet, watching for breath, tapping with a stick, might not be enough anymore. We've been lucky, not careful. Back at the tower, I slid my pack open and pulled out the guide. I wanted to be sure. The margin notes under Type 3 matched the conditions exactly. Minimal scent, long dormancy potential, higher probability of activation from pressure or environmental change. He had a subheading I hadn't noticed before, unpredictable wake cycles. There was a list of observed triggers. Some made sense, footsteps nearby, changes in light, temperature shifts. Others surprised me. One entry just read, sharp drop in barometric pressure, 3 incidents, suspected reaction to storm front. That's the kind of thing nobody talks about anymore, because nobody tracks pressure, not without equipment we stopped manufacturing decades ago. I turned a few more pages and found another section I hadn't studied before. Gray labeled it, Low-Tech Isolation Techniques for Unconnected Zones. It had tips for surviving long-term without electronics or fuel. Some of it I'd already figured out. How to dig proper waste pits away from water sources, how to use clear tarp to gather condensation, how to set up mirrored panels to bake dry goods. But there were other entries that filled in real gaps. Wire mesh placed in horizontal layers within a chimney vent will disrupt smoke signature without affecting air draw. Use if staying in known infected zones. Soap root, Chlorogallum pomeridianum, can be boiled and thickened into a cleaning agent that removes infected fluids from soft materials. Use hot water, not direct flame. If you cannot grow food, grow medicine. Ginger, lemon balm, and crushed red clover reduce gastrointestinal effects from contaminated water when filters fail. Gray also kept records on how different animals responded to the virus. Not just urban pets, but wildlife. He had a full appendix marked Immunity and Vectors, Non-Human Response. He described testing infected fluids on scavenged animal remains and observing wild animals interacting with infected corpses. According to him, canines showed some resistance, possibly due to dietary enzymes and stomach pH. He noted that most wild dogs scavenged infected flesh only when desperate, and even then avoided internal organs. Rodents, on the other hand, avoided infected altogether. One quote stayed with me. Observed rats at Site 7 refusing to cross corpses for 4 consecutive nights. Food placed across the body was untouched. Either instinct, scent profile, or something else triggers avoidance. That lines up with things I've seen. In every overrun zone, rats are scarce. Squirrels vanish. Even scavenger birds stay clear of older infected piles. Not out of luck, out of learning. Animals may not reason the way we do, but they adapt fast. Faster than we do. Gray understood that. He even theorized that bird migration had altered in response to infected mass movement. I don't know how you'd test that now, but the idea makes sense. We've always focused on what the infected do. Maybe we should have been paying more attention to what everything else avoids. Tucked near the end of that chapter, he wrote a simple, unnumbered tip that felt more personal than most of the guide. If you see silence in a place that should have noise, windless trees, still birds, no insects, stop moving. Assume you've stepped into something wrong. Leave the way you came. I underlined it and added it to my own notes. One more section near the end caught my eye. Gray called it Old World Tools, What Still Works and Why. That's where he listed a handful of low-tech items still useful long after the power grid went dark. The flashlight I built from camera gears was similar to one he described. He favored rotary dynamos over solar due to reliability in poor weather. He also recommended certain model radios from pre-collapse emergency kits, not because they were strong, but because their frequency dials were analog and less likely to spike into infected drawing bands. Avoid scanning wideband on emergency handsets unless fully enclosed. Stick to fixed low-frequency loops. Never test frequencies in open air unless absolutely certain of sector status. I made a mental note to check the insulation on my receiver again. It's held up, but the wires are exposed near the base. I'd been meaning to wrap it with another layer of rubber tubing, but I'd run out of sealant last week. I'll have to find more on the next supply run. Gray had also included a full-page list of plants that grow wild in the northern sectors and their basic uses. Some for food, some for water, some to avoid. One note in bold: do not eat mushrooms unless grown in controlled space. Too many strains absorb necrotic toxins from the soil. Effects may not show for days. I've heard stories about that before. People getting sick long after eating something they thought was safe. Confusion, memory loss, slow respiratory shutdown. I hadn't known it could be tied to corpse soil. Now I do. I stayed inside the tower room another hour going through that section, cross-referencing it with what I've seen growing in the wild. Most of it matches. The plants that survive now are the ones that root shallow and grow fast. Anything that pulls deep from the soil is more likely to be tainted. That makes sense. I just hadn't thought about it in those terms before. It's not enough to survive anymore. You have to know what part of the world is still feeding off death. There's a red circle around a district labeled 4B Secondary Storage Vaults. Gray underlined it 3 times and wrote a single note beside it. Variant samples. Do not enter without filter mask. Mutation suspected. That kind of warning should stop someone cold, and maybe it would have, years ago. Now it just slows me down for a minute. I don't have a filter mask. Haven't seen one that still works in over 2 years. Most people don't bother. Not because we think we're safe, but because survival stopped being about preparation a long time ago. We survive by moving. That's it. You find food, you find water, you move. Stay one day too long, and you're either scavenged or surrounded. Those of us still breathing live light and live fast. Not smart, just fast enough. I folded the map and slipped it between the manual's pages, then zipped both into the pack. It was still early in the day based on the amount of light pushing through the cracks above. Sky stayed dim, but the wind had shifted, which usually means more stable air for a while. That's the window I needed. Getting to District 4B meant leaving the relative safety of the sunken high-rises and crossing a stretch of open ground lined with collapsed transit platforms and partially flooded utility tunnels. I stayed above street level where I could, picking my way across disconnected concrete slabs, catwalks, broken scaffolds. Every few minutes I'd stop and listen. ears tuned for footsteps that don't match mine, or the distant echo of infected. Sound travels oddly in these sectors. Dead cities have their own acoustics. Too much glass and steel, not enough soft surfaces left to absorb it. Gray's notes mentioned mutation suspected in 4B, but no details. I've heard that word used plenty of times in the caravans and border camps, usually as an excuse. Mutants did it. Something faster got 'em. That wasn't a normal walker. But that's just how people explain what they don't understand. We say mutated, instead of admitting we never studied them properly. Gray didn't throw words around like that. So if he wrote it, he saw something real. Something different enough to log it on paper, not just tell stories. Most people I know wouldn't care. I've traveled with groups that would have burned the manual for warmth, or traded it for an extra canteen. I thought about going back once, bringing the guide to show them, but I don't think it would matter. Their way of life depends on pretending there's nothing left to learn. If I handed them 200 pages of tested survival logic, they'd skim the first 10, argue about the meaning of a sentence, then toss it when food ran low. That's why I left. You can't teach people who only want to survive until tomorrow. They don't want systems. They want luck. I don't. Crossing into 4B took the better part of an hour. The air was heavier, but not toxic. Still, I tied a cloth around my face just in case. The buildings here were smaller, spaced further apart. Storage facilities, likely. Some of them were still intact. Others burned or collapsed inward. No signs of recent movement, no scavenger trails. Just age and weather damage. Inside the first warehouse, I found racks of broken crates and crushed shelving. Most of the labels had faded. Some still bore partial markings. Fluid stab, TENS RK, gene, and then a smear, where something had wiped it clean. Medical maybe, or research. I moved slow, careful not to disturb anything. My boots crunched old glass underfoot. The place was silent except for the wind slipping through broken vents above. In the back corner of the warehouse was a locked door with a coded keypad. The panel was dead, but the lock was already broken, bent inward by force. I pried it the rest of the way and stepped through into a smaller room, probably a control office. More racks, sealed cabinets, dust-heavy air, and at the far end, a shelf covered in old radio equipment. It wasn't just a relay station. It was a testing center, the kind used for short-range bursts, military-grade transmitter banks, heavy insulation, soundproofed walls. None of it had power, but everything looked placed, not looted, as if it had been left in a hurry or sealed on purpose. I dropped my pack, took out the manual, and flipped to the section titled Signal-Based Agitation Patterns. I hadn't read past the intro before. The main points were underlined. Infected react to specific frequencies. Band tested 7.400 MHz. Low-volume rhythmic pulses provoke directional movement in coordinated groups. Result: increased clustering, heightened agitation, occasional vocalization. He tested it. Not just once. There were log entries with timestamps, dates, descriptions of terrain, infected response, distances. He described sending out pulses from tower to tower and watching groups change direction without any other stimulus. That confirmed a suspicion I've had for years. Sometimes, when camps vanish without a trace, it's not a breach or an accident. It's signal exposure. Maybe someone nearby turned on an old radio without realizing it was on an active band. Maybe someone thought broadcasting was a way to find others, but all it really did was bring attention. I pulled out my portable transceiver. It barely works. Salvaged from 3 different units, held together with wire, tape, and a few pieces of scavenged circuit board. Normally I only use it to scan for bursts or check for relay signals along the old emergency bands. I never transmit. Today, I made an exception. I set the dial to 7.400 MHz and turned the gain low. Static buzzed through the speaker, soft and uneven. I kept the mic off. Just monitored. After a few minutes I picked up a hum. Faint, but repeating. Could have been leftover signal bounce. Could have been background frequency bleed. Or maybe it was nothing. But I turned it off anyway. Even listening might be enough, depending on what's nearby. I thought about the camps again. Back when I traveled with a salvage crew from the northern fence line, we lost 2 members during a rainstorm. No noise, no screams, no blood trails, just gone. Some said they slipped off the trail and drowned. Others said it was a pack that got smart. But maybe they carried a radio. Maybe the mic flipped on and pinged something nearby. None of us even considered that kind of mistake at the time. We assumed we were alone, but Gray's guide says we never were. There was a recording unit mounted to the side of one of the testing consoles in the room. The tape inside was labeled in smudged ink, Loop 12. I pried it loose, pocketed it, then scanned the nearby shelves for any others. Found 2 more. No labels. No idea if they still work, but they're worth carrying. I wrapped them in cloth to keep the moisture off and stored them in the bottom of the pack next to the guide. I didn't find any direct evidence of mutated infected in this building. No corpses, no cages, no remnants of containment systems. But the way the air feels here, the silence, the layout, the shape of the floors, it doesn't feel right. There's too much insulation for a place this small. The walls are thick, the doors sealed, the roof reinforced. This place was meant to keep something in, not just protect from outside threats. I don't know what they tested here, but I'm not staying. I logged the building's coordinates on my slate and marked the door with a scratch symbol I use for already cleared. High risk, no return. On my way out, I paused at the edge of the hallway. In the silence, I could hear something faint. Not footsteps, not wind. Something that felt like a low murmur through the wall. I didn't stay to identify it. I backed out slow, turned without running, and made my way toward the outer perimeter of 4B. I won't sleep in this district. Even if nothing's moved, it feels wrong. I'll circle back toward the higher elevation buildings near the old tram depot. There were a few sealed storage rooms there. I didn't check them earlier because I assumed they'd already been picked clean. Now I'm not so sure. The path back followed a wide pedestrian overpass that used to connect several industrial office buildings to the tram line. Most of the glass was shattered, and the metal underfoot had started to buckle in places, but the frame held. I stuck to the inner beams and avoided walking under loose panels. Anything too loud could carry for blocks. The last thing I needed was a sudden noise drawing attention from the lower levels. I passed over a collapsed loading bay where one of the old transit buses was half submerged in grey water. The vines had almost completely grown through its windows. Something about it felt untouched, like the world moved on and forgot that bus existed. I kept moving. When I reached the depot, I slipped in through the west side entrance, where the ceiling had partially collapsed. It looked like someone had tried to barricade the doors long ago, but weather and time had pulled everything down. I stepped over broken pallets, old plastic storage containers, and a crushed vending machine that still had a few shattered candy wrappers underneath. The depot had a 2-level layout. First floor was mostly open, ticket counters, maintenance bays, and break rooms. Upstairs held the offices, storage vaults, and an observation deck that looked out over the rail line. I headed for the stairwell in the back. No signs of recent activity. No drag marks. No dried blood. Just still air. The upper floor was darker, but intact. Most of the windows had been boarded or reinforced with sheet metal, probably by whoever used this place as a temporary shelter years ago. I found 2 of the sealed storage rooms in the eastern hallway, exactly where I remembered them. One door had been kicked in, ripped right off the frame. The room behind it was empty, just bare metal racks and water stains on the floor. The second door, though, still had its original locking bar across it. No scratches, no dents, just rust. I pulled out my pry bar and worked it under the latch. Took about 10 minutes to free the bolt. The seal groaned as I pushed it open, but nothing broke. I stepped inside and shut the door behind me. The room was dry, cooler than the hallway. No windows, just a concrete box with 4 rows of metal shelving and several heavy-duty crates stacked along the rear wall. Everything smelled old, but not spoiled. The kind of scent you only find in places that have been forgotten but never violated. I set my pack down, turned on my lantern, and started checking the labels. Most of the crates were empty or filled with cracked plastic jugs, old batteries, and crumbling rubber gloves. But one had a reinforced lockbox inside, sealed with both a keypad and a mechanical latch. The keypad was long dead, but the mechanical side gave after a few hard hits. Inside were 6 vacuum-sealed packets marked with faint lettering. I wiped the plastic with my sleeve and read the faded ink. Tissue hold, Gen 3, 4B storage only. I didn't open the packets, not without knowing what was inside. Each was labeled with a unique serial number, followed by a date. 17th of August, year 57. That put the sample collection during the 57th year after the outbreak, based on old world calendar tracking. That alone made this the most recent physical evidence I've ever seen tied to the early mutation period. Gray's guide mentioned Generation 3 behavior once, in a margin note. It wasn't in the main chapter, just a scribble beside a chart on decay timelines. Gen 3 carriers observed in humid low-oxygen vaults. Containment failure likely. No reliable documentation past Y59. No mention of symptoms. No photos. Just that one sentence. But now I had something physical to match that note, and that made it real. I packed the samples tightly inside a side compartment, wrapped in cloth to keep them from shifting. I had no plan to test them or open them, not without proper lab conditions, which don't exist anymore. But keeping them intact might matter later, even if only for comparison. Proof that there was once a structure behind all this madness. That someone, somewhere, tried to understand what the infection was doing, instead of just running from it. I set up for the night inside the same room. The walls were thick enough to block outside sound. Only one entrance, easy to defend. No mold, no rot, no movement under the floor. I ate one of my last 3 ration packs. Just stale protein mix wrapped in wax paper. Barely tasted like anything. Then I drank half a canteen and rolled out my mat. As I sat in the corner, I found myself flipping through the guide again, not reading, just skimming with the lantern low. I stopped at the section on survivor group dynamics. Gray had some strong opinions. He described the difference between individual survival and collective patterns, said that most survivor groups fail because they rely on habit, not comprehension. People repeat what others do without questioning whether it still works. I know exactly what he meant. The last group I traveled with lived on routine. Pack up at dawn, move 8 miles, search 2 buildings, stop at dusk, no exceptions. Same approach no matter where we were. If we came across a blocked road, we went around. If someone was missing, we moved on. They had a checklist mindset. No room for new variables. The only time I tried bringing up the changes I'd noticed, differences in infected response patterns, shift in movement clusters, they ignored it. Said I was overthinking things. Said it didn't matter because if you just stay quiet and keep moving, you survive. That might work for a while, but I don't want to survive on luck. I want to understand what's still out there. Why the infected act the way they do. Why some places feel empty for days and then suddenly swarm. Why the patterns shift without warning. The others didn't care, so I left. Gray's guide was probably ignored too. Maybe that's why he ended up alone in that bunker, locked to a chair with no supplies left. Maybe he knew no one would believe him. Or maybe he believed too much and thought it would be better to leave a message than try to convince another group that didn't care. I think about that when I reread his warning on page 74. Knowledge dies in repetition. If you copy what kept someone alive last year, you might survive a month. If you learn what killed the rest, you might survive the season. The others wouldn't hear that. They'd call it paranoia or theory talk. But everything I've seen so far lines up. His map is accurate. His signals warning was real. His notes on dormant infected and scent detection have already kept me alive. So I'm going to keep going. I'll follow this through. Even if no one ever sees what I find, I'll know I didn't just wait around for something to kill me. It was early when I left the depot. The clouds had thinned enough for weak sunlight to creep through. I judged the time by the warmth on my right side as I walked east, probably mid-morning. The clock I built from scraps flipped between 8 and 10 repeatedly before giving up. The second hand twitched once, then froze. It'll need rewiring again, but not today. That thing's more of a comfort than a tool now anyway. I trust the sky more than a ticking needle soldered together with melted e-waste. The air outside was still. No birds, no wind, no movement on the water below. From this part of the city, I could finally see the curve of the seawall in the distance, where the old floodgates used to control the coastal runoff. It looked skeletal now, eaten out by time, but parts of the spillway still held. The tram lines that used to bring workers across the district were collapsed into the floodplain, twisted like dropped wire. Beyond them was the target grey-marked, Relay Point, South Sector, status unknown. He had underlined the word recovery, but left a question mark beside it. That's what brought me out here. If Gray didn't know what was inside, then no one else did either. The path toward it led through a narrow causeway flanked by partially submerged buildings. The concrete footing was cracked, vines trailing in from the walls above. I stayed near the center and avoided making contact with the walls. Places like this sometimes echo sound unpredictably. I took slow steps, scanning ahead with my flashlight. It's a hand crank unit I built 2 years ago from the casing of a broken camera and a gear set pulled off a bicycle. I need to wind it every few minutes for a solid charge. When it's fully wound, it gives about 6 to 8 minutes of usable light, depending on temperature and battery stability. Right now, the glow was steady but low, enough to see maybe 15 feet clearly. I cranked it slowly as I walked. Thumb braced near the switch so I could kill it fast if needed. I was about 100 feet from the old relay entrance when I first heard the scrape. Not loud, not constant, just a brief sound, wet contact against pavement, then silence. I dropped my bag, crouched, and clicked the flashlight off. The dim light vanished, and I let my eyes adjust. Nothing in my immediate view. I waited in place, breathing through my nose, listening hard. The second sound came about 30 seconds later, closer, same texture, same rhythm. When the shape finally emerged from behind the collapsed bus shelter, I knew right away what I was dealing with. Standard infected, type 1, walked with a heavy left drag, favoring the right leg, spine curved inward. Clothes were sun-bleached and shredded, skin blackened from exposure. It didn't see me at first. Wasn't running, just moving, scanning the area slowly. I stayed crouched, waited for the right angle. When it passed in front of my pack, I moved. I lunged in with a sharpened iron rod I keep in my belt sheath. Not a blade, more like a thick spike wrapped in wire at the grip. I aimed for the side of the neck, but the angle was off. It struck bone and deflected. The infected turned fast, snarled, and swung with its right arm. I backed off, caught its wrist with my left, and shoved hard into the chest. It fell back but didn't lose balance. These things don't tire. You have to finish it or run. I struck again, this time straight through the eye socket. The rod pierced the skull with a dull crack, and the body seized once before falling limp. No noise followed, no echo, no response from anything nearby. I waited 10 seconds, then 30, still quiet. I checked my hands. No breaks, gloves intact, no fluid spray on my sleeves. I kept the cloth mask over my face just in case and crouched beside the body. Most people would leave it there, or loot it, or burn it, if they had the time. I dragged it off the path and into the remains of what looked like a former street kiosk. I didn't want it visible from the open walkway. If others were watching, or worse, following scent trails, it needed to be hidden. Once it was clear, I checked the guide. I remembered Gray had a whole chapter on efficient takedown zones. Most of us go for the head, smash, stab, crush, whatever gets the job done. But Gray's notes are more specific. He wrote that the infected nervous system reroutes after death, and that motor control centers remain functional even with severe cranial damage. His preferred strike points were lower brainstem, cervical spinal cluster, or complete cervical vertebrae severance. Basically, if you want to stop one of these things instantly, don't aim for the top of the head. Hit the brainstem or disconnect the spinal cord. I checked the one I just killed. The rod had gone in at a steep upward angle, probably missed the ideal stem entry. It had seized, but not dropped immediately. That lines up it. I pulled out my knife and tested the idea. A direct cut across the upper spine from behind would be faster, harder to pull off in real combat, but now I understand why some infected keep crawling even after you think they're dead. I folded the guide back up and made a mental note. Adjust strike angle, practice on dummies later. After cleaning the rod and checking for any lingering scent, I returned to my pack and resumed the approach toward the relay station. The entrance was partly buried under a collapsed retaining wall, but a side hatch marked Emergency Ops was still intact. I pulled the rusted lever and shouldered the door open. Inside was darkness, the kind that makes your flashlight seem smaller than it is. I wound mine again, one full crank. The light buzzed faintly, then stabilized. The corridor beyond the door was short, maybe 20 feet, ending in another sealed bulkhead. This one was partially ajar. Dust drifted in the beam of the flashlight. No footprints, no signs of recent passage. I stepped through. Inside the relay station, everything smelled of dried plastic and ozone. It was colder than the outside air, likely insulated by the thick concrete. Racks of equipment stood in rows, some collapsed, others intact. The main console bank had a large monitor, cracked down the middle but still showing residual LED glow in one corner. I checked the power source. A backup solar array mounted outside the hatch was still connected to a trickle inverter. Unstable, but enough to blink a light. I toggled the circuit and watched the monitor flicker once before dying. There was no way to know if any data survived. The hard drives were probably corroded or wiped during one of the pulse events that hit the city decades ago. Still, I pulled one drive bay from the rack and slipped it into my pack. If I ever reach a lab with a clean reader, I'll see what's left. Gray didn't leave notes on this location beyond the map marking, but the layout matched the standard civil defense relay designs from the old-world blueprints I studied. I checked the far room and found exactly what I hoped for. An analog supply locker mounted to the wall. Inside, one sealed water pouch, 2 compressed rations, and a small pack of sterile gauze. The pouch had a 4-year expiration window, and the date printed was year 39. That means it's long past safe, but the seal wasn't ruptured, and the packet was still firm. I kept it anyway. That was it. No more samples, no logs, no survivors. Just one old station still standing. I stayed for another hour, searching every shelf, every panel, every drawer. Nothing. When I finally stepped out again, the wind had picked up. The clouds were shifting. Sunset was coming. I couldn't see the sun itself, but the light had gone soft and horizontal. Shadows stretched further. The infected don't track time like we do, but they move differently in low light. Slower in open terrain, faster in closed quarters. I didn't want to sleep in the same sector again. I made for a stairwell on the eastern edge of the zone that led up to a half-collapsed skywalk. I had seen it earlier in the day. Looked risky, but passable. Turned out only part of it had fallen. I climbed through the gap and found a small roof ledge with 3 walls and a half-bent canopy overhead. Perfect for a temporary shelter. I didn't eat. Not yet. Still too wired from the fight. Instead, I sat there with my legs over the edge, flashlight off, listening. In the distance, faint echoes bounced from somewhere deeper in the city. I couldn't place the source. Could be wind, could be movement, could be something else. My ears were still tuned to the rhythm of the infected steps from earlier, that slow, dragging shuffle, followed by irregular bursts. You hear that sound enough times, and it carves itself into your brain. You don't need to see them anymore, you just know. But what I heard now didn't match that pattern. It was subtle, dull, not enough to pinpoint, but enough to stay awake a little longer. I stayed on the rooftop for another hour. The shelter I'd found, 3 concrete walls and a half-bent canopy, did a good job of shielding my silhouette. I leaned against one wall and kept the flashlight ready. One crank before I sat down gave me enough charge for emergencies. It was cold. Not freezing, but enough that my fingers began to stiffen. I pulled my sleeves down and breathed into my hands to keep blood flowing. When I finally opened the manual again, my fingers were stiff, but I could still hold the pages flat without creasing the spine. I flipped through the earlier chapters until I found the section I remembered only skimming before. Late-stage evolution indicators, unconfirmed observations. It was tagged year 85. That's when most of the structured world was already gone. According to Gray, organized field research had ceased by year 70. Anyone still collecting data after that point was doing it on their own time and risking their life to record it. This section was different. Gray didn't use his usual clinical tone. His writing was messier. Sentences ran longer, fewer edits, no charts, no bullet points, just paragraphs of field impressions. That caught my attention. It was rare for him to sound even remotely emotional. He began the entry with this: "If you're reading this section, you already understand the basics. You know how they track, how they respond, how they decay. But if you're still under the impression that the infected remain static over time, stop now, go back, because this part doesn't fit the patterns, and if you don't believe it, you'll die thinking you were smarter than you are." The entire section was dedicated to what he called post-latency phase adaptives. I read that term 3 times. I'd never seen it before. Gray described infected bodies that had reached apparent neurological dormancy, like sleepers, but then later reactivated in a way that didn't follow the normal aggression response. These weren't just dormant then awake. They moved differently. They paused. They observed. He didn't write that word, observe, as a guess. He documented one instance where he left a bait trap using a light source and a looped human vocal recording. According to him, the infected approached the source, halted, tilted its head, and backed away. That kind of behavior isn't consistent with what we believe. It suggests pattern recognition, not full cognition, not intelligence, but behavioral memory. That's worse. Something that can't think, but can remember what it responded to last time. Something that learned fire hurt it, or that sound in a certain rhythm led to a dead end. Gray called this adaptive avoidance. His words, not mine. He then described what he believed was the first evidence of environmental imprinting, meaning an infected that adjusted its movement patterns based on previous terrain. One example stuck with me. He found deep scratch marks along a narrow service corridor. Not unusual, but the scratch lines avoided every loose tile and electrical snag perfectly. The infected had moved through the corridor without triggering the tripwires he'd placed days before. He didn't believe it at first. Reset the wires. Waited. Watched again. Same result. That was when he started writing year 85 like a shift had happened. No one I've met believes in infected memory. Not like this. We assume they respond to sight, scent, heat, and noise. If they don't see you, you're fine. If you move fast and clean, you get through. But what if some of them no longer chase everything that moves? What if some of them wait? What if they've begun to identify what is worth chasing? That would explain something I've seen myself. A year ago, on the edge of the southern lake bed, I watched an infected step off a ledge rather than charge a fire-lit perimeter. It didn't panic, didn't flail. It dropped with intent. I thought it was just coincidence. But reading Gray's notes makes me question that. Maybe I wasn't wrong. Maybe that one had seen fire before. I stayed on the rooftop most of the night, eating in silence after I finished reading. Half a protein bar, just enough to keep my stomach from cramping. I drank the last half of my filtered water and scraped the inside of the pouch clean. I needed resupply soon. I'd marked a few locations on Gray's map for potential caches, but I wasn't counting on them. In the morning, I moved west toward a series of low industrial buildings that looked untouched. One of them had the faded logo of a logistics company, something long defunct even before the outbreak. I climbed through a cracked skylight and landed inside an open assembly floor. Empty conveyor lines stretched across the floor, silent for decades. The dust was undisturbed, not a single boot mark. Good sign. I stayed there most of the day, scavenging and sorting. I found a dry storeroom and pulled together supplies. 2 sealed water bottles with cracked labels. Edges of the caps were rusted, but the seals held. 1 bag of freeze-dried potatoes. Expired, but edible. a case of heat tabs, mostly crumbled, but 4 still viable. I took all of it and packed tight. Just as I was about to leave, I saw something that stopped me. On the far wall, near a locked cage of electrical components, someone had scratched into the paint. 4 lines of jagged letters. 9 echo broadcast dead. Gray was right. Do not run. Do not signal. Some of them listen. They do not always follow. I read those words twice. 3 times. It wasn't fresh. The paint had bubbled around the edges, but whoever left that message had read the same guide I was holding, or heard it broadcast. Somehow Gray's voice or writing reached someone else. That meant his influence extended beyond just his bunker. Others believed him, others tried. It also confirmed something else. The infected aren't just decaying, they're changing. Gray wasn't documenting superstition or fear. He was cataloging the shift between instinct and patterned response. That kind of shift doesn't come from magic. It comes from time, from stress, from mutation. 90 years is enough time for anything to evolve. If not biologically, then behaviorally. And if even a small fraction of the infected began passing that on, the threat isn't what we thought. It's not just numbers, it's adaptation. By midday, I was halfway to the burned tower, Gray marked with a black X. I moved along a series of broken rooftops, occasionally dropping to street level when the gaps were too wide. The buildings here were more skeletal than the others I'd passed through. Fire had gutted most of the interiors. Wood turned to ash, steel warped from heat, glass gone entirely. What little was left had been washed out by decades of storms and flooding. But even in the silence, I could feel something strange in the layout. It wasn't just what the fire destroyed, it was what it left behind. This part of the city had once been cleared and converted into a temporary safe zone. I saw the signs, painted markers on concrete barriers, faded banners hanging from metal poles, rusted bins labeled decon. They'd tried to build a camp here, temporary housing, checkpoints. I even found a stretch of mobile fencing tied together with chains and faded hazard signs. All the classic signs of a failed attempt to reclaim a slice of the city. Based on the damage, I don't think the infected broke through. I think the camp collapsed from inside. The tower stood just beyond a wide drainage canal. I crossed on a narrow maintenance bridge, barely holding its bolts. My boots scraped the rust as I moved, and I kept my center low to avoid tipping the whole thing sideways. Once across, I found the base of the tower. Its upper frame had collapsed, the top half broken off and resting against the roof of a nearby building. But the foundation was still intact. I stepped inside, pushing past a melted sheet of old tarp that had been nailed to the frame as a makeshift windbreak. Inside, I found something unexpected. Someone had lived here. Not recently, but long enough to leave a structure behind. A cot made of bundled wires and woven scrap cloth. A cooking plate. A radio mounted on a frame of wood and wire. Batteries long dead, but wiring still in place. And in the center of it all, what looked like a stack of notes. Handwritten. Pages torn from old manuals, packaging, and instruction booklets. Notes written in 3 different styles. Not just one person. This had been a relay site. Not official, not organized. Just a place where someone, maybe a few, had tried to continue what Gray started. The first set of pages contained copied sections of the guide, almost word for word. Gray's rules, repeated and circled. Some had been edited, clarified, added to. Someone had taken his theories and expanded on them. A few entries were marked with tested confirmed, while others were scratched out. One in particular stood out. It was written in heavy pencil on the back of a shredded evacuation flyer. Rule 37. If they stop chasing you, it's not because you're safe. It's because you've entered somewhere worse. I read that 3 times. It wasn't in Gray's original guide, at least not in the version I have. This was something else, something newer. A rule passed forward from someone who had seen more than Gray. That hit harder than anything I'd found so far, because I'd seen this before. Moments when infected suddenly lost interest, turned around, or even scattered. We always assumed something startled them, or that we got lucky. But what if it wasn't luck? What if we just wandered into a dead zone, a place they don't go? I searched the tower for more. No sign of bodies. Whoever used the site was long gone. I found a few spent shell casings and a melted bag of rations. Nothing salvageable, but I found one final thing that confirmed everything. Tucked behind a wall panel was a hand-scratched audio reel. No label, just a torn strip of tape with a single word: Grey. There was no power in the tower to play it. My portable unit wasn't compatible. I didn't want to risk damaging it. So I packed it carefully and placed it between the layers of cloth with the rest of the notes. I'd take it with me to Tower 17. That was the next checkpoint on Grey's original map. Still active last I heard. Still broadcasting, if the stories are true. The sun dipped low. I knew I wouldn't reach it before dark, but I had enough to keep moving, enough water, enough direction. I climbed out of the tower and took the west-facing ridge path. From there, I could see the outline of the sealed inner zone, the final ring. Beyond it, nothing but marshland, dead cities, and old power lines. Nobody lives out there. Not anymore. Maybe not ever again. But somewhere beyond that is a relay that still sends out a signal. I've picked it up before. Short bursts. Faint. 7.400 megahertz. No words. Just a tone. Maybe on repeat. Maybe someone's still out there trying to say something. Maybe not. I don't know if what I've found will matter. I don't know if these notes, these samples, these dead rules are still enough to change anything. Most people don't want to believe things are changing. They want the infected to stay dumb, slow, predictable. But they're not. And if we ignore that, we're already dead. So I'll keep moving. I'll keep reading. I'll keep recording everything until the light dies or the signal stops. Maybe someone will find what I've left. Maybe they'll add to it. Maybe that's how we survive now, not through weapons or bunkers, but through memory, through the rules passed on by those who watched the world end and still tried to write it down. I'll end this log with the last line I copied from the tower wall. It was carved in deep, scratched right into the frame of the old transmitter base. We survived the collapse, but we were not the last version of human, and they were not the last version of dead. And that's where we'll stop for now. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell me how the story hit you, what moments worked, what didn't, and what you'd want to hear next. And a big thank you to everyone supporting the channel, especially with extra membership: Carlos Herrera, The Great Anywho, Jadala, Madam Midnight, Deborah Powell, William Blackwell. You keep this project alive. Until next time, Survivor. Jack's Nightmares signing off.